Hello there, and welcome to another instalment of Wrong Way's Colombia Cast with me, Brendan Wrongway Corrigan. Now, I'm delighted to say that our guest for this episode is an influential and renowned historian, the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and author of no less than 16 books. I'm sure he'll correct me if I'm wrong on that, though. His most recent being The Square and the Tower, a timely work on the important role of human networks throughout history. He's also currently working on the second volume of his Henry Kissinger biography, although considering how much he is in demand these days, I'm not sure where he finds the time. Niall Ferguson, the international man of history, to use the title from your Twitter account bio, welcome to Wrong Way's Colombia Cast.
It's a pleasure to join you, Brendan, and I've lost count of the number of books, so could be 16. And as you say, I've got a couple more still to go.
And eagerly looking forward to reading them as well, Niall. But I know you're one of those historians who doesn't believe that it's not your place to engage in discussions of current affairs nor make predictions about the future, and I certainly agree with that. So with that in mind, and glancing to the future, but with your historian's eye, and before we discuss things more specific to Colombia and the region, you said in an interview earlier this year with the former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, John Anderson, that in years to come, historians may view COVID-19 as a mental illness rather than a virus-induced infection, considering the approach many Western countries took in tackling it. Can you remind us why exactly you said that, slightly tongue-in-cheek as I think it was?
Well, Brendan, the future historian will look at the performance of at least two, maybe three of the English-speaking countries, the UK, the United States, and also Ireland, and wonder why they did so badly, why excess mortality was so high in those countries in 2020, when it really ought not to have been. On paper, Britain and the US were well prepared for a pandemic. Indeed, in 2019, I think there was a survey that rated those countries very near the top of the league table of public health quality. And yet, when a real pandemic turned up in January, the outcome was a pretty disastrous failure. Usually in the media, that just gets blamed on the leaders in question, President Trump, Prime Minister Boris Johnson. The Irish Prime Ministers got off lightly by comparison, but in truth, I think it's better understood as a failure of public health bureaucracy. There were plenty of countries that got this right. Taiwan, South Korea, but also two English-speaking countries, New Zealand and Australia, have had extremely low excess mortality, hardly any, in fact, and relatively tiny numbers of infections and deaths in relation to population. So what went wrong? And I think the answer is that the people responsible for preparing for a pandemic greatly misjudged the nature of the new coronavirus coming out of Wuhan, and spent January and February and the first 2 weeks of March kind of dithering around, sometimes talking about herd immunity, sometimes dismissing COVID-19 as just a seasonal flu. And by the time they realized that it was a great deal more serious than that, it was very far established in the populations, particularly in the big cities like London and New York. And then there was a sort of panic in mid-March, lockdowns of the economy, people ordered to stay in their homes for weeks on end, which did halt the spread of the virus ultimately, but also cratered the economies. And so it's really a kind of catastrophic story of misjudgment, the worst of both worlds, really, dithering around and being complacent when you had to take early action, and then taking this very blunt instrument called a lockdown by the time it was really too late to stop the contagion. That's part of what I had in mind. But I also think I was alluding to the fact that in the midst of this pandemic, and it certainly isn't over in the United States, because there are at least a dozen states where I see second waves happening. In the midst of this pandemic, we've decided to have a completely unrelated debate about police brutality towards African Americans, an important issue, but not really a particularly relevant one in the midst of a pandemic. And I think future historians will wonder why it was that in the midst of a pandemic, Americans decided to become tremendously agitated about a long-standing issue entirely unrelated to the problem of public health, and indeed to hold large protest rallies, gathering people together, which is exactly the thing you don't want to do in the midst of a pandemic. So that was the sort of madness I was alluding to.
Yeah, of course, events took off in the States, but these have happened before, and we've seen these kind of protests. But the global nature, I guess, of this latest Black Lives Matter, the timing, as you said, is quite interesting. Do you think it's something that might actually lead to meaningful changes going forward?
It's conceivable. Clearly, there are some important issues that remain to be resolved in American policing. It's not so much that US cops disproportionately use lethal violence against African Americans. They don't, and that the statistics are pretty clear on that, especially when you allow for the relative importance or relative roles of different racial groups in violent crime. What is true, this seems pretty clear, is that the cops are inclined to use physical violence, pushing and shoving and restraining suspects more with African Americans than with white suspects. That's something Roland Fryer showed in a paper published back in 2016. And so that's one of a number of issues that I think it's worth pondering. I think there's an obvious training deficit in many police forces. What happened in Minneapolis when George Floyd was killed was a kind of extraordinary lapse in terms of police training. Several of the officers who were standing around while Derek Chauvin asphyxiated George Floyd, as it would appear from the video, were very new indeed to the job, and what Chauvin was doing will doubtless become a little bit more clear at the trial, but by and large you don't commit homicide while people are filming you. That's certainly unusual. So there's a kind of issue of training, but these meaningful discussions that we can have, I'm not sure are really happening. Instead, there are meaningless discussions in which people chant preposterous phrases like defund the police, which is really a silly slogan. There clearly is a desperate need for effective policing in many, indeed all American cities. And it's worth remembering that in the midst of this great discussion, there was a spate of homicides in Chicago, just to take one example, nearly all of them African Americans killed by other African Americans. It's not as if police killings are a huge share of American homicides. They're not. So I think what's depressing to me is that, firstly, in the midst of a pandemic, we're being distracted by an issue unrelated to the public health crisis that's unfolding. And secondly, that the debate is so completely charged with emotion and indeed vituperation that we are very far from a serious data-driven discussion of what is wrong with American policing. That's the problem, I think, with a public sphere dominated by the internet these days, that it's quite hard to have a sane discussion of any issue. The culture of Twitter, but not just of Twitter, is a culture of denunciation, not discussion. And so anybody who ventures to say anything that is remotely at odds with the rhetoric of Black Lives Matter risks being denounced, or as they say these days, cancelled. And that really doesn't help at all, because it means that the possibility of a rational discussion fades. and you end up just with slogans and as I said, denunciations. A good illustration of the way in which this can have completely counterproductive results is something that Roland Fryer pointed out in a new paper. When a viral incident of police violence goes around the world, or at least around America, when there's a video of some incident of police violence involving an African American, there's usually an investigation. And as Fryer shows, as soon as one of these viral incidents becomes the subject of a formal investigation of the police, policing comes to a near standstill in the city in question. And as a result, there's actually an increase in homicide and all kinds of crime. And you end up with hundreds of additional homicides relative to what you would have expected. So when you have a debate that isn't focused on data, that isn't actually based on a serious and social scientific approach to the issue, you can quite often end up with policy responses that are completely counterproductive. And defunding the police would be a good example. The mayor of Los Angeles announced, no doubt under political pressure, that he was going to reduce the budget of the Los Angeles Police Department. If that leads to an improvement in crime in Los Angeles, then, my name's Mickey Mouse.
or it's Niall, not Neil, as many people get it incorrect.
Well, it's funny you should bring up the subject of the pronunciation of my name, Brendan, because it's the Irish who mispronounce the name Niall, a good Gaelic name that you can find in all kinds of different countries, including the Scots and Irish Gaelic communities, but the Irish, when they were relearning Gaelic in the Gaelic revival in the late 19th century, relearned it with some mispronunciations, of which Niall is one. And it's quite irritating because throughout my life I've had to correct people when they've called me Niall, pointing out that that's a river in Egypt. But it's ironic because there's this other character, Niall Ferguson, spelled Neil, who's shot to fame or notoriety as an epidemiologist at Imperial College London. And for the last 5 months, I've repeatedly been confused with him by people who can't spell. And so I get periodic death threats on Twitter because my epidemiological model had flaws and led to lockdowns. And it's kind of absurd, but it's made me realize that I should just have gone along with Niall years ago and just accepted the Irish pronunciation, because it would have reduced the number of death threats in 2020.
Indeed. That might be a bit close to my heart, because I think Douglas Hyde would have been part of that Gaelic revival in the late 19th century, and I'm from the same county that he's attached to, at least. I think he was born there as well. But anyway, you were talking about the unintended consequences of when a police killing goes viral, and then the increase in black deaths in communities because there's a lack of policing. Coming back to the virus briefly, obviously the unintended consequences of these lockdowns, and you talked about inaction at the start and then overreaction afterwards. And a previous guest, a hostel owner in Colombia's second city of Medellin, spoke about, now I'm paraphrasing, but basically that we have these lockdown measures to save the lives of generally elderly people. As I said, I am paraphrasing, but then we perhaps are damaging the lives irrevocably of younger people and businesses. So would you agree with that to a certain extent?
Well, one has to kind of draw some distinctions before making blanket judgments on this subject. There's a variety of different measures that can work to contain the spread of a pathogen like SARS-CoV-2 and the disease COVID-19. The best and most effective methods are the ones that were used in countries like Taiwan and South Korea, and to some extent in Germany, whereby you test very broadly and then you contact trace when you find somebody who tests positive. And that requires a kind of capacity to test and a capacity to contact trace, which not all countries have. It also requires some effective border controls so that when people come into the country, you can test them and make sure that they're not going to be the super spreaders. This is the key to understanding COVID-19. About 80% of infections are caused by 20% of people, roughly speaking. So you have a very unusual way in which the disease is spread. It's not a homogeneous population where we all have the same risk of infection and we all have the same risk to infect other people. It's not like that. And in just the same way, it's a relatively defined subgroup of the population that is really vulnerable to the disease. That's the elderly or people with comorbidities like obesity and hypertension. So policies that identified or recognized the heterogeneity of the population in terms of who's spreading it and who's dying from it got this right. What went wrong in a number of countries, including the US, was that the opportunity was lost to do early widespread testing because there just wasn't sufficient testing capacity, and the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, completely screwed up January, February into March. There was just nowhere near enough testing capacity in the US. At the same time, the US has mysteriously dithered around on contact tracing. Contact tracing can be done very efficiently if you take advantage of technology. Smartphones are wonderful repositories of data, as some of us already had realized. Our location data and our interactions with other people are all recorded on devices. And so technically it would not be difficult for the US to do very, very efficient contact tracing. But for whatever reason, Google and Apple have been very slow to implement a contact tracing app. And so that hasn't happened. If you can't do widespread testing and you can't do contact tracing, then you end up with very blunt instrument policies like shelter-in-place orders telling people you have to stay at home, and economic lockdowns, basically closing down workplaces. And this is economically incredibly disruptive, as might be expected. If you tell people they can't work, don't be surprised if gross domestic product collapses and unemployment soars. And that's what's happened in a great number of countries because they failed to do the smart policies and therefore went for the dumb ones. Lockdowns are a pretty blunt instrument for dealing with a disease like this. Sure, you're going to stop contagion if you lock everybody up in their homes. Though, of course, if you lock them up in elderly care homes and then allow people to come in with the virus, you're going to kill lots of people too. Let's not forget the lockdowns had their downsides. But yeah, I mean, you stop the spread of the disease because you significantly reduce the number of places in which people can meet indoors in large numbers, which is the places, those are the places where the disease spreads. But think of the cost of doing that. You might be stopping contagion, but you've also stopped economic activity, and that doesn't feel like a good trade-off, considering that ultimately COVID-19 is not one of the most dangerous diseases in human history. It's not the Black Death. It's not even like the 1918-19 influenza. Its infection fatality rate's probably below 1%. And as I said, it's heavily concentrated in the economically inactive part of the population and amongst retirees. So I think the basic observation is right, that if you adopted the lockdown approach, you were going to have some public health benefit, but the economic cost would probably outweigh that benefit. I think that's almost certainly right. But when you look at a country like Colombia, or really any of the big South American countries, Brazil and Chile are in even worse shape in terms of deaths per million as we look at the data now. I think the big question is, what really were Colombia's options at an early stage of the pandemic? And I had a conversation with some people in the government there early on when they sought out my advice. And I think it became pretty clear in the course of that conversation that Colombia didn't really have the capacity to do the smart policies of some East Asian countries, and was therefore going to have to rely on rather cruder policies to cope with COVID-19. And I think this is true across South America. And the most that one can really say at the moment, looking at Colombia's situation, is that it has done better than Brazil and Chile, which which is, is significant. That is important, because in Brazil and in Chile, things are really very bad indeed. And in Colombia, they're quite a bit better.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say that at times it seems like there doesn't seem to be a plan B. We just keep on getting extensions added on to the lockdown and quarantine measures. And then other things that seem a bit arbitrary, like children under the age of 5 not allowed to leave their homes. And obviously in this country we have an awful lot of poor people living in inadequate accommodation, 3 to 4 generations under the same roof with poor ventilation. Like, because people have said, when you talk about the economic impact, that it's dollars for lives or pesos for lives here. But I've never really agreed with that, in a sense that I think we could be adding to a death toll or certainly health problems down the line as well. That's been my take on it anyway, that when do you cross that line where the collateral damage is worse than the virus itself?
Well, I think one has to avoid expressing the trade-off too crudely, and there's certainly been a lot of that. It's very clear that there are costs to obliging people to stay at home and preventing them from work that go beyond the economic costs. There aren't very accurate estimates yet, but if you look at the UK, which has pretty good data, you can see that there's, in the worst months, in April and May, there was excess mortality quite significantly above what you'd expect in those months of the year, and it wasn't all COVID-19. And the most obvious thing that was happening there was that people with serious conditions, say heart conditions, were not going to hospitals, were not seeking medical assistance, and consequently there were more deaths from heart conditions than there would otherwise have been. It may be, though I don't think I've seen good data on this, that there's been more domestic violence. It may be that there has been more death from mental illness, depression, suicide. We're still really, I think, trying to see those trends in the data, and it's a bit early to be sure how big the effect is. But yeah, I mean, I think if you tell people in a relatively poor country, an emerging market like Colombia, you have to stay at home and you just have to stay there, you create a whole bunch of serious problems for the poorer classes whose accommodation isn't spacious, isn't particularly comfortable, and if you have families crowded together in small apartments for prolonged periods of time, you're going to end up with some health costs quite separate from COVID-19. So I'm not sufficiently well informed to criticize how the Colombian government's handling this. Suffice to say, they faced the same problem that has been faced by other South American countries, where you don't really have the capacity to do testing and contact tracing. And what's your choice? If you look at the age structure of South American countries compared with, say, Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, there are a lot of elderly people. And if you just let the disease rip, you're going to have significant excess mortality. Herd immunity is a very expensive thing to go for with COVID-19. And I think most countries who toyed with this policy, Sweden and the UK, for example, came to realize that it really was too costly, because COVID-19 really does have a high infection fatality rate for anybody over the age of 60. And just letting it rip is what amounts to genocide. I wrote a column about this some time ago for the London Sunday Times, saying that if you don't take action, you are committing genocide. That is to say, you're going to kill a lot of elderly people. And old lives matter, if you can forgive me for playing on this currently topical slogan. So I don't know what good option there is for a country like Colombia under these circumstances. We can see in the data that the case numbers have been rising relentlessly since March. So there's no sign of a flattened curve there, despite the measures that have been taken. And as I said, when you look at mortality, the most that can be said is that things are going better than in Chile or in Brazil, But it's still not a good story, because the trend is still upwards, and indeed quite steeply upwards. I mean, just to illustrate the point, you're looking at about 1.69 deaths per million on the basis of the latest data. But if you go back to this time last month, it was 0.24 per million. So that is a pretty significant jump that there has been in mortality. And when you look at other countries which we haven't mentioned, say Peru or Ecuador, where there really has been very high mortality, and the excess mortality for Peru is about the worst that I've seen, it's clear that Colombia could get into an even worse position 4 weeks from now. In fact, it's quite likely to be in a worse position 4 weeks from now. I wish there was a solution. I think we're going to see a generally very bad outcome in South America over the coming months, where if you remember, the story starts in China, then it moves to Europe, to Italy. Now we're in the phase of thinking, oh God, the United States is really screwing this up. But actually, by next month, we'll be talking about the disaster in South America. And it won't be the first time that a pandemic has had a very severe impact on South America. If you go back to the influenza pandemics of the 20th century, the big ones in 1918-19 and in 1957-58, they hit Latin American countries very hard indeed. And although people have kind of forgotten that history, there's a sense in which it's repeating itself. And I think the explanation for this lies in the fact that Latin America has pretty big cities with pretty dense populations, and rather poor public health infrastructure, and of course wide inequalities, so that any kind of pathogen that comes along to which the population doesn't have resistance is likely to do quite a lot more damage in Latin America than, say, in Europe.
Mentioning inequality, and obviously, no matter what way you look at this pandemic, it is going to be a major disruptive event like previous events that we've had in history, and they've led to some fundamental changes in society, be it in terms of fiscal policy or international alliances and such like. Do you think maybe the Western world and the first world, the developed world, might look at this now and see the effect this pandemic is having, and probably will have a greater effect on poorer countries, that we need to do more to try and close that inequality and improve the lot for the poorer people in these regions? Well,
I think there's a couple of points to make on this subject. The first is that the emerging markets, or if you prefer developing countries, have much less room for maneuver on the fiscal and monetary side. Remember the response in the United States and in Europe has been to offset the impact of lockdowns with extraordinary expansions in fiscal and monetary policy. So you've seen a deficit in the US that could be 17 or more percent of GDP in 2020. You've seen the Federal Reserve balance sheet explode in size, tremendous monetary growth to offset the shock of the lockdowns. That's much harder to do if you're a South American country, because the bond market just doesn't look so favorably on you as it looks upon the United States. And so there are real constraints on what can be done with fiscal and monetary policy relative to the North American or West European countries. That's the first point. The second point is that because lockdowns have all kinds of knock-on effects, particularly when it comes to food production, there is a significant risk that what was already a bad situation in some countries last year becomes disastrous. The World Food Programme's most recent report predicts a really huge increase in the number of people around the world who are suffering from not just hunger but serious food shortage, bordering on malnutrition. And so if one looks at a country like Venezuela, which was already in a catastrophic state because of the appalling misrule of the Maduro Chavista regime, that is a country where people are quite likely to starve this year. And so there's a kind of double set of problems. First, you can't do much economically to offset the shock. Secondly, people really starve if there are food shortages in some southern hemisphere countries. I think that when we get a chance to take stock, and it won't be for some time because I don't think the pandemic will be over until at the earliest sometime next year for the world as a whole. I think we'll probably step back and say, well, first, that this should never have happened, and the Chinese government bears a heavy burden of blame because it failed to act early enough in the face of this new and dangerous pathogen, dithered around, did cover-ups, kind of lied to the World Health Organization, which kind of went along with it, and didn't really try to lock down Wuhan until January the 23rd. It was way too late. By that time, untold numbers of people, millions of people had traveled from Wuhan to not just to China, but to the rest of the world. And some unknown percentage of those people had the virus. So I think point number one, there must be a far more rapid and effective response to any kind of biohazard like this. You don't have time because we have such extraordinary rapid communications around the world because of air travel that you really have to act in days, not weeks, much less months, if you want to contain a new pathogen. And remember, the next one could be worse than this. SARS-CoV-2 is by the historical standards not an especially deadly pathogen. But just imagine if this was like any of the great influenza pandemics of the past, and it was killing people under 5 at the same rate that it was killing people over 65. Think how much more traumatic that would be. So rule number one, China failed, the WHO failed, and we need to have a far more rapid response the next time a new virus appears, and there will be a next time with 100% certainty, I can tell you that. Mm-hmm. Secondly, once you have that in place, the next step is each country needs to have its own rapid response regime in place. There isn't any real reason why Colombia should not be able to do testing and contact tracing if it does it early enough. Because if you do it early enough before the virus is spread throughout the population, and it's not on an unmanageable number of cases, you're not testing an unmanageable number of people, and you're not doing an impossible amount of contact tracing. The thing about what is necessary is that it's not really beyond the range of a country like Colombia. Most people in Colombia have mobile phones, a significant percentage of smartphones. And so in theory, you could in fact do what they did in Taiwan if you had it in place and ready to go at the first alert that you received. I first heard about this new virus on January the 3rd when a friend emailed me saying something funny going on in Wuhan. If everybody had acted on January the 3rd and gone to Biocon alert number 3, as opposed to DEFCON, if we had a kind of rapid response to that initial negative news, we could have at quite low cost contained the spread of the virus. You just have to take early action. This is something that the great epidemiologist Larry Brilliant has said many times. Early detection, early action is the key. He was one of the men responsible for eradicating smallpox. So it's his TED Talk you should watch, not Bill Gates's, because Larry Brilliant really knows what he's talking about, as opposed to amateurs like Bill Gates and indeed me. So, I defer to the real experts in the field, and that's just a very simple message. Early detection, early action. And that way you avoid lockdowns. If that had happened in Colombia or Brazil or Argentina or Chile, if that had been done in January, people wouldn't now be locked in their homes and the economies wouldn't be in the tank.
Yeah, you lessons to be learned, of course. You mentioned Venezuela in passing, and of course that's always highlighted here for people who might think that Colombia could do with having a more left-leaning administration. But perhaps one fallout from this pandemic will be that there are people who feel the government has been a bit too cozy to big business and its capitalist approach, that a leftist candidate in the next election, and Duque, the current president, who of course is right of centre, can't run again, so it will be whoever he nominates as his successor to run in the next election, that Colombia could drift a little left. We've seen it in the mayorship here in Bogota, and indeed in local elections last year. It was seen as sort of a move away from the centre-right that Colombia has kind of held firm on for the last number of years. Would you be concerned? Because obviously seeing what's happened in Venezuela under a socialist government, now I'm not saying Colombia would go that far, but there could be a tendency that it would go left and disrupt the relationship that it has with the United States.
Well, I'm going to tread warily here. You know, the history of the last century or so is littered with the reputational carcasses of American professors who pontificated about countries they barely knew, and as I've never even visited Colombia, I would be a fool to start opining about its politics. But I have spent quite a bit of the last 10 or more years thinking about South American politics broadly. I wrote about it in the book Civilization. I've become keenly interested in Argentina through friends, and so I'm kind of inclined to say in Latin America, and this has been true for the better part of a century, there are two deadly temptations. The deadly temptation of the populism of the left, which in its most extreme form can lead you down the Venezuelan path to hell, but also the temptation of the populism of the right, which has tended to flirt at the very least with military power, and that's another path to hell. And so the challenge for all Latin American countries is to try to stick to a center ground in which you can have debates between social democrats who want to use policy to reduce inequality and what we might call Christian Democrats, using European language, who think that the key is the market, and without growth there's no redistribution worth doing. That's I guess the debate that Chile has had really since the restoration of democracy, and I think that's the right debate. Its neighbor Argentina has not managed to get to that center ground. It came close to doing so under Mauricio Macri, but unfortunately avoidable mistakes by the Macri administration led to a kind of classic emerging market crisis in the currency and in the debt market, and back came the Peronists, and here we are again with the usual suspects wrangling over an Argentine default. So I think the key for Colombia is to make sure that the range of political options is not too wide, because as soon as you have the populism of the left or the populism of the right offering their quick fixes, you risk actually destroying either the economy, which is what the left specializes in, or destroying the free society, the open society, which is what the far right tends to do. That's really, I think, the way to think about the recurrent problems of South American and indeed Central American politics.
Yeah, and well, I guess from the Colombian perspective, and well, like any president, he has his critics, but I think Juan Manuel Santos, the previous president, you could say, kind of treaded that middle ground fairly well. I know you're tight enough for time, Neil, because there's one question I want to ask you, and it's maybe kind of going to your bread and butter in a sense, a counterfactual history question, because in obviously Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World, a brilliant book, and any balanced reading wouldn't exactly say it's a complete panegyric for empire and colonisation. However, the balance is that the British Empire did more good than harm. Now, I often hear relatively well-educated Colombians here say that they would have been better off had they been colonised by Britain rather than Spain when looking at the state of affairs to the north and in the US and Canada. Now, to me, that's a rather simplistic view of it, considering the quite different circumstances that were at play. But what would you say to such Colombians who would say this, that things would have been better under the British?
Well, it's important to make clear that in the book Empire, I wasn't writing some kind of whitewash of the British Empire. Only people who haven't read the book think that. I mean, chapter 2 has the title White Plague to describe the impact of British settlement around the world. Hardly the language of colonial apologia. But the basic point the book makes is that the paths to modernity that were available in, say, the year 1600 were not that numerous, and there were definitely worse paths than the one that British settlement and British rule created. The obvious divergence in experience of North America from South America would seem to illustrate that pretty clearly. I wrote about this in the book Civilization, noting that one of the distinctive features of Spanish settlement and rule was that there was no regular redistribution of land. In fact, it was essentially conquistador conquers and then keeps, and future settlers don't get a share of those initial large territorial estates that were carved out in the early phase of Spanish settlement. And so you get this pattern in North America where land is essentially redistributed. New settlers come along after a certain point, they're getting 100 acres. And that's how North America functions from very early on, long before 1776. Whereas in South America, that's not what happens. Same goes for Central America. You end up with very, very large concentrations of landholding and then very big cities with people who don't own any property at all. And that persists so that when you get to the early 20th century, there's a really massive difference in distribution of land between North America and Central and South America. So that's, I think, a key reason why not only the economic history, but also the political history of Latin America has gone in a different direction from what we could call British America, the US and Canada. I think the point, though, is that British influence was not absent in South America. It was really very considerable. In the 19th century, Britain de facto, through its enormous financial power, through banks like the Rothschilds, whose history I wrote, exerted considerable indirect, informal influence over Argentina, certainly, Brazil for sure. And that means that it wasn't it's not a totally straightforward counterfactual. There was actually a lot of British informal empire going on in South America in the 19th century and into the 20th century. But it's certainly true that there was no formal, or virtually no formal, British rule. And I think that's really one of the reasons why the direction of travel has been different. But let me offer as a sort of concluding counterfactual the following scenario. What would have happened if Spaniards and Portuguese sailors had actually ended up in North America, and British settlers and traders arriving rather later on the scene had found themselves in Central and South America? Just let's just change the geographical destinations. Would the British have been as successful in South America as they were in North America? Would Spain and Portugal have had the same somewhat negative impact on North America that they had in Central and South America? And that's a good question, because it reminds you that the resource endowments were very different. The thing about the North American story, which is an argument made by a number of other historians and political scientists, Jim Robinson and Darren Acemoglu most recently, there weren't that many people there. There weren't that many gold mines. In fact, there was hardly any precious metal to extract. The easy options weren't there. And the easy option in colonization is tax the locals, enslave them if they don't comply, and then dig up the gold and silver and send it home. Now, that would have been an option for anybody who turned up in Central and South America. It wasn't an option for anybody who turned up in North America, really. And that's why in North America you had to just get on with farming, because there wasn't really that many other options. So I think the counterfactual is more complex than your friends in Colombia may be assuming. Much as I welcome Anglophilia whenever I encounter it, it's rare enough in the world these days. I think one has to be honest. When the British turned up in a place that had lots of people who could be taxed, India, that's what they did. And most Indian historians would probably argue that wasn't a tremendous outcome for the people of India. My view is that actually India, under British rule, on balance, did better than it would have done without British rule if it had stayed under Mughal rule. But that's another counterfactual and certainly subject for another podcast.
Well, another exactly, because I know you're very, very tight for time, and I was going to mention Ireland too in that regard. But I needed to ask that question, but I want to briefly, I know you need to go, so a 2-sentence answer perhaps. Venezuela again, and this is bringing it to modern times, to today. Direct military intervention by the United States, do you think that's conceivable?
Well, it's certainly conceivable. Clearly it was being discussed, and there's more evidence on that topic now from John Bolton's controversial memoir of his involvement with the Trump administration as national security advisor. I mean, I think that the problem for the US is clear, that its record of intervention in Latin America and the Caribbean going back over more than a century has not really been a string of unqualified successes. And that means that there's almost always going to be blowback if the US tries to tip the domestic balance in any Latin American or Caribbean country. In Venezuela, you have a regime that is as destructive as any that we've seen in the world in the last 50 years in terms of the harm that it is doing to its own people. It is a criminal racket that runs that country. And tragically, all efforts by the internal opposition to oust Maduro and create a democratic government have been unsuccessful. Under those circumstances, it seems kind of a no-brainer to do something to tip the scales in favor of the democratic opposition. But it's very clear from what we're beginning to learn that the Trump administration was deeply divided on this issue, and I think missed the opportunity when the opportunity was there to intervene, and to intervene in a way that probably would have been significantly beneficial to the people of Venezuela. That I think is the most that can be said at this point. I don't know if the opportunity has passed. I do know, and this is maybe the best note on which to end, I do know that with every passing week, the plight of the Venezuelan people gets worse. The thievery goes on, and the body count will rise. As I mentioned, it's one of the countries at risk of starvation in 2020. A shocking thing to reflect on when you consider that Venezuela was once one of the richest countries in South America.
Yeah, indeed, and it's a country I've visited 4 times since 2012, and I have a lot of friends there, and it's a very sad situation. Okay, I know you've got to go, Neil, and I really appreciate the time. As I said, you are a man in demand at the start. I said that, but just one final thing, in a word, I am Irish. Irish unity in a generation. Could you see it happening?
No.
I actually agree with you on that one. Neil Ferguson.
You asked for one word, and that's the one word I've got.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I know with your answers we could go on, but you've got to run. Maybe, as you said, we could do podcast numero dos, as they would say here, in the coming weeks or months. Niall Ferguson, an absolute pleasure. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us here on Wrong Ways Colombia Cast. You can find Neil on Twitter, of course, guys. Your Twitter handle is, Neil?
At nfergus.
At nfergus, the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Thanks very much for joining us. If you want to contact me here on the podcast, you can by my Twitter handle at WWayCorrigan. and the Facebook blog page is Wrong Way Corrigan Blog. Until the next time, ciao ciao.
Cheers, Brendan.